You are listening to Counter Esperanto podcast, tangents about Twin Peaks with Carl Eckler and Jubal Brousseau from the Pseudo Spaces Network. Hello, everybody. It's been a while. We won't bore you with the details, but we're back, and we are recording on February 24th, otherwise known as Twin Peaks Day. This is the day that Laura's body was found, and the day after she died. My name is Jubal Brousseau, and I am here with my co-host,
Carl Eckler.
And this is our tribute to Laura Palmer. We had a tribute to Dale Cooper, and that was a lot of fun to do, and we got really good feedback on that, so we decided to do one for Laura. It's interesting because we just, for the first time, managed to read The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer. 25 years after we actually watched the series for the first time, we finally got around to reading this, and it's a whopper, isn't it, Carl?
Yeah, not in size, but in punch.
You tried to read it before, right?
I did. I tried a couple of times, actually. I've owned it for years. I never made it all the way through because every time I'd start again and it'd just be like a gut punch.
Yeah.
One of the most horrifying and disturbing stories I've ever read.
I made a remark to you after I finished it. For all the sex in the book, it is decidedly unsexy.
The book is a deep and terrifying exploration into the dark side of American small-town sexuality. There's no defense against the fact that this is about how a young and, as we all are originally, we're born as tabula rasa, blank slates. Laura's slate got filled up really fast, and it got filled up with a bunch of stuff that was pretty ugly. What really made it possible for me to finish the book this time was that I was able to see that for all the horrible situations that Laura was put into beyond her control, she was able to exercise a huge amount of agency in dealing with it, up to and including how she decided to end her life, essentially.
Yes, that's something that a lot of people don't realize until they sort of take in at least the series and the film. The degree to which Laura, she wasn't in control, but she managed to essentially beat Bob at his own game. And Lynch, of course, still complicated everything with more questions regarding Leland's culpability and all of that. This book really does a great job of putting you inside her head during not just, of course, the time leading up to her death, but really her entire adolescence.
Lynch did a great job of complicating culpability of various parties because the series says one thing and Fire Walk With Me says something very, very different.
There have been pieces written, usually just about the series, talking about how the mythology essentially kind of problematic because it lets Leland off the hook. And I can certainly see that if you just take the series. And I think that it must have been this book and Lynch's sort of thinking about what this actually meant. And I wouldn't be surprised if, his daughter who wrote the book, Jennifer Lynch, if this sort of put him in a space to where he was realizing that there might have been a problem with how it was handled in the series. Ultimately going back and kind of showing this is really a story about trauma, and not just small town trauma, but also middle class.
It is very class-based because Laura is essentially upper middle class. A child of a lawyer and someone with the means to have a home and very nice house and cars, and she even had a pony. The stereotypical upper middle class girl's wish was fulfilled for her. She actually got a pony on her 12th birthday.
There is an entry somewhere where she talks about how she got all of these things, but everything was tainted. The pony was dead. The cat got hit by a car. Mm-hmm. That everything was sort of taken away. You look at that picture of Laura Palmer, her homecoming picture with her crown and everything, her tiara. It's interesting to think of preconceived notions, how you think, okay, this is probably a girl that kind of has everything. She is full of privilege. And yes, I'm sure she did enjoy still certain kinds of privilege.
Well, that picture looks very, very different to me now that I know what Laura thought about it.
Actually, let me read that quote from the diary. This is an undated entry towards the end of the book, and she's talking about what she was thinking when she had the pictures taken. I had such a story behind my smile on the photos and at the football game as well. I still felt the hands and the mouths of the men I had been with hours before the photo was taken. One thing that really strikes me about this book is how self-aware she was about what was happening to her. It's interesting because you think about her relationship with Dr. Jacoby, and Dr. Jacoby is definitely a creep, and he's kind of a complicated guy, but it's interesting because she talks about how she felt that she could open up to him, and she found a lot of comfort talking to Jacoby because he accepted her for everything that was going on. He knew things about her that no one else did. But I kind of wonder how those conversations actually went down, because it seems like he would have gone to some authorities if she was saying that there's a man that comes into my room, every week or whatever.
Well, technically, psychologists are mandatory reporters, but Dr. Jacoby isn't a very good psychologist. As has been pointed out elsewhere, he really should be in research, not in practice. Dr. Jacoby knew what Laura was telling him, but the question in my mind is always how much of it did he believe was real and how much of it was the result of her schizophrenia. She is, to some point or the other, schizophrenic. Her talking about Bob, the way that he manifests and speaks with her, it's very easy for a psychologist to diagnose that as being schizophrenia.
Yeah, I've heard Bob as being described as not necessarily simply a metaphor of the evil that men do, but as a metaphor for schizophrenia, which is an interesting take. I have a feeling that with Jacoby, though, she might not have talked about Bob specifically. She might have talked about the other things that she did. The acting out, as he probably would have seen it.
Yeah, she doesn't talk about him much. I know she did mention his name in the last tape, or one of the tapes that they recovered from either Jacoby's office or her room. That indicates to me that Jacoby thought that Bob was a manifestation of her mental illness.
Let's back up a little bit, and we should talk about the first time we watched Twin Peaks and what our view was, because if there's one character that changes over time, and also the different parts of this text that you engage with, for example, we're only just now getting down to reading the diary, but when you watch the series, you get a completely different impression, or rather your impression is changed once you see the film. So let's think back to when we were watching the show on VHS. What was the way that you saw, what was Laura to you?
Well, definitely before I saw Fire Walk with Me, Laura was simply a troubled victim of a murder. I accepted the face value of the text that she was the troubled victim of a father who murdered her under the direction of an inhabiting spirit.
With the series, you're getting sort of a face value. I remember kind of thinking about all these roles that she played. Okay, so she did the Meals on Wheels. She tutored Josie in English. She was a companion and tutor for Johnny Horn, homecoming queen, the girlfriend of the star football player. She was a prostitute. She was a drug addict. She was troubled in ways that aren't actually described. You kind of think, how did she have time for any of this? How did she pull the wool over her parents' eyes and her friends' eyes so much? And so you kind of think it's almost ridiculous. You almost think that only a character that is absent from the story that you're watching is capable of these things, because to see them on screen would be almost impossible to believe.
I always thought that, and then I realized two things reading the diary. Well, I realized one thing long ago and one thing reading the diary. The thing long ago was that she was doing a whole lot of stimulants during the time when she was doing all those things. She was not sleeping very much, and she came home a lot at 9, 10 o'clock after doing all of her actual work and all of her different jobs. The other thing that I realized was I realized that Laura Palmer was brilliant. I mean, she had a definite, if not genius level, she was a very, very intelligent girl who learned very quickly. She didn't have to spend a lot of time on homework. She actually remarks that it's too easy, that it wasn't enough to keep her distracted from all the other horrible things that are happening. She was able to, do a lot of multitasking because she didn't have to spend 4 hours on homework every night because she had it done by the time she got out of study hall.
That idea, too, of her doing these stimulants, it creates a daytime Laura and a nighttime Laura. One of my favorite quotes, August 6, 1986. I sit awaiting his arrival, kept awake by the notion that I shall grow accustomed to the dark far easier than he to the light. She knew that she was doing battle. One of the things that was always puzzling to me in the series was the Briggs family is having their session with Jacoby, and Jacoby makes the parents leave, and he talks to Bobby and says, did she laugh at you? Did she, why was she treating him like crap and forcing him to sell drugs and stuff like that? You realize that if she let herself relax, this in the book, if I let myself relax, if I enjoy these sort of simple, innocent pleasures, that gives Bob an avenue to attack me.
Mm-hmm.
She really wanted to be nice to Bobby, but she couldn't allow herself to be.
I don't want to get too psychoanalytical because I'm not a psychologist or anything other than a schmuck who took Psych 101. But from what I can tell, that's a common defense mechanism amongst abused children, that they create a secondary protective personality in order to shield the innocent part of themselves, the part that's too weak to fight. With the wrong kind of treatment or a lot of trauma can lead to what they're now calling dissociative identity disorder, what they used to call multiple personality disorder.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because you think of the multiple levels of symbolism that Bob could represent. In the case of Leland, there's this idea of the evil that men do and all that. But in the case of Laura, he represents trauma. He represents actually the effects of trauma, this feeling of self-loathing, the guilt, even though you're completely guiltless in this situation, this feeling that you've done something wrong, that you're bad.
Yeah, and everything that he says to her is all about how it's all her fault and that she enjoys it. It's putting the blame onto Laura, which makes a lot of sense because that's what abusers do to their victims in order to make certain they don't talk.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the thing when Bob is saying these things, when he basically tells her that she's bad and that she doesn't deserve love and all this stuff, it makes me wonder how much of that is actually coming out of Leland's mouth and how much of it is her thinking to herself as she's writing, because this is stuff that's getting written down in the diary. I kind of wonder what one of those sessions, how that actually played out in reality, if he was inhabiting her or something in those moments.
That is an interesting question. I doubt that we will ever know. I think that's the point. I think that it's left purposefully vague so that we are uncertain whether some of the more supernatural or more outre portions of what Laura is describing in her diary, whether they're real or not.
That's one of the reasons why The Secret Diary is much more than just a tie-in peripheral novel. I've heard it described as a really quite accurate depiction of systematic abuse over years, what goes on psychologically with people who suffer this kind of abuse. And that's probably one of the main reasons I haven't read it, honestly, until now. Having a reason to read it for this podcast was the only way I would have actually gotten through this.
Yeah, that was the other thing for me, too.
After watching Fire Walk with Me, how did your view of Laura as a character change?
Well, she wasn't a ghost anymore. That's one thing. I mean, we got to see her as the real frightened girl who was confronting just unimaginable pain and horror that she was. In the series, we only really got to see the public face of Laura in her recordings, in her traces. The photograph is the false face that she presents to the world. I think she's close to genuinely happy when she's on that picnic with Donna and the
James?
Wild Rider. Yes. Yeah. Still, that's the happy Laura. We never see the dark Laura except possibly in the lodge. We see a shattered section of her personality.
Firewalk with Me was interesting because, yes, she's not a ghost anymore, but also it changes her from object to subject. That's another thing, is like when people question whether or not Twin Peaks is sort of a misogynist work because, the idea of fetishizing this dead girl, victim blaming, all that kind of stuff. I think that sort of falls by the wayside because of this book, the fact that he got his daughter to write it, and the fact that he almost killed his career to produce that film. Kind of flies in the face of this idea that there was somehow a just kind of like yet another cheap dead girl story, on everyone's hands.
I don't hold a whole lot of truck with people who view Lynch as a misogynistic director. I think he is certainly a product of the time he grew up in and the place that he grew up. That's not the same as being a man who hates women. A lot of the things that he struggles with in his films are about the people that do actually hate women. Frankly, it's not just the people. Those people are an outgrowth of a society that is misogynistic.
Right.
And he's trying to foreground that.
Yeah, its depiction is not the same as condoning.
Yeah.
I think Lynch himself has said that you don't have to experience death to portray it on the screen. You don't have to experience a certain kind of trauma to depict it. You just have to be as honest as you can to the idea. The authenticity will be there if you stay true to the idea. Trauma is at the center, of course, of Twin Peaks more than anything. There's a reason that the Garmonbozia, the pain and suffering, is a food. Sustenance is something that is a motif that runs through the whole thing. Intaking substances, whether it's coffee, cocaine, cherry pie, or pain and suffering in the form of creamed corn. There's a sublimation of a need. There are other forms of nourishment. Trauma is at the center, and that is, for better or worse, that is a form of sustenance in Twin Peaks.
Yeah, and I think the idea of trauma as being the fuel that these entities live on is really interesting. I think I sent you a copy or a link to a copy of a book called Caliban and the Witch.
Oh, yes. I didn't read it, but I saw that you did.
Caliban and the Witch by Silvia Federici.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm not Italian. Essentially, Caliban and the Witch is about how the witch hunt in Europe that took place mostly in the 16th century, actually, is a direct outgrowth of capitalism, basically. It is a Marxist interpretation of the phenomena, the history. Not in a Soviet sort of way, that's Marxist-Leninism, but Marx interpreted everything through the veil of economic systems, boiling down Federici's premise into very simple and into an almost irresponsibly simple sort of interpretation. What the book is about how essentially capitalism and misogyny went together hand in hand because capitalism needed to have control over the society to a degree that hadn't existed in Europe up until that time, and people didn't like it. So in order to impose the system on people, it became necessary to distract them. In order to do so, the church came up with the Great Chain of Being hypothesis, where they imagined basically everything being in a pyramid of power that started with God at the pinnacle, went directly to the Pope, who was his emissary on earth. The Pope gave dominion unto the monarch, and the monarch collected taxes and fealty from the nobles. The nobles ran the army, which kept the peasants in line, who were separated and locked into particular portions of land. As a sop to the peasants, well, they told the head of household, which was always the man, you can't ever beat the system, but you can beat your wife.
I've heard that saying before. Yeah, that's terrible. Insidious and quite effective, apparently.
Yeah. Anytime there were things that subverted this order, they got smashed down really hard. A lot of the crusades against the late Middle Ages, early modern era heretics were about people who didn't believe in that particular view of the world. A lot of the witchcraft trials were against women who wanted to take power in male spheres. One example Federici gave was, I think it was Venetian wool dyers. And there was a guild for women dyers and for male dyers, and it didn't go so well for the women. They got accused of witchcraft. When women wanted to deliver babies as midwives, they were frequently targeted as witches because, well, male surgeons wanted that business. So on and so forth, until it became accepted that a woman's place is in the home.
Right.
And we're still kind of waking up from that nightmare.
Institutional misogyny obviously has been around a long time, and of course it manifests in a lot of different ways. There's been a good number of feminist scholarly work on Twin Peaks. It's interesting to look at this book in that light. It's interesting to see, it's like the idea of abuse and guilt and feeling that you're not worthy. If you think of it in terms of something that Bob basically started. He started working on her psychologically. Again, we don't know to the degree to which Bob did that or Leland did that, because Bob does have some kind of access to her brain. He's not able to inhabit her and, taste through her mouth like he wants to, as he says at some point. But he does have access to her mind.
Yeah, and it works either way. If one can take a fully materialistic view of Twin Peaks, and it still works that she's just disassociating, that she sees the scraggly-haired, scary character Bob whenever Leland is in the abuser mode. and she sees her father when he's wearing his father knows best 50s sort of Leland.
It's not a mistake that when he sings in the series, it's always corny novelty songs from the 50s.
That's very much the happy, smiling, advertising circular view of the 50s, which the real 1950s was nothing like.
That was something that was so subversive, not to get too off track, but so kind of subversive about Mad Men as a series, because it showed you, even though it started in 1960s, the 60s as we think of it didn't start until the late 60s. It's kind of crazy how sexist that time was. I mean, we know it was, but it's kind of crazy to watch a show or something, seasons and seasons of it, how the world was and how it was subtly changing, but boy, not fast enough. Leland Palmer is from that era. He was, he would have been born just probably in the 40s, maybe late 40s, but he's a product of that era. But when you read this book, you kind of realize that essentially what Laura became, she says at some point that I am sort of becoming what Bob wanted me to be. It was a self-defense mechanism and an effort to beat him at his own game. He's like, I'm not going to let him have the satisfaction of controlling me. If I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it my way, because it was either that or death. And eventually she knew she had to die in order to prevent the full fruition of what Bob's intention was, which was to completely possess her.
And she embodies that resistance in a bunch of different ways. On page 61 to 62... That's July 25th, 1986. She went out to the woods, and I looked very carefully, and when I knew I was alone, I pulled a marijuana cigarette from my pocket. I made Bobby get one for me. He wanted to share, but I told him he couldn't. We could do some together later, maybe. I smoked it very slowly and started thinking about sex, about men, all kinds of them, inside me. I tried to think of things that Bob would like. I pulled a pair of my panties on my pocket and rubbed them on the tree. And that's the tree where it seemed like he would always take her during the night. Half of the time through this passage, she seems to be trying to summon Bob, which, she could summon him. That gives her the power. She says, "Come out, Bob. Come out and play." The wind picked up, but I never saw Bob. When he doesn't show up, that's when she laid down, and I came like I never have before. My body just couldn't stop, and I had to grab onto the tree, peel off bark in one place, grab again, dig in with my nails, and then it slowed. It seems like, to me, in that passage, she is taking back control of her sexuality. She learned how to give herself pleasure and enjoy it instead of having it taken from her constantly by her attacker. At the same time, of course, she feels, because of how our society screwed out about sex, nasty and bad and dirty about it. She says, "I'm going to pass this test. You'll see. If Bob wants nasty, all I need is a little time. I can be the bad girl he wants." And then on the way out of the woods, I was nearly killed as an owl swooped out of nowhere.
I could feel the power in his wings as he shot by me. I thought of the log lady, something she said, "Many things are not what they seem." Owls do figure in this book probably more than any other of the mystical motifs. One of the things that strikes me is that she goes through this phase early on where she's sleepwalking. Her mom walks in on her in her sleep and she's hooting like an owl.
Yeah.
There's a giant owl, which is mentioned even in the Secret History. And the log lady talks about how, in her own oblique way, possibly being abducted during a camping trip, which of course she was.
I think I've mentioned before in UFO lore, a lot of times owls, specifically very large owls, are interpreted as screen memories for UFO abduction. You see this owl, and it might seem normal or it might seem outsize. There's a lot of talk that what people really saw in Point Pleasant during the Mothman sightings, it could have just been a giant owl, or it could be a large owl that they, for whatever reason, thought was larger. Or there's theories that say that that's a screen memory, and what they actually saw was, some alien that projected a mental image of a large owl as a screen memory of what actually happened.
While we're now on this sort of esoteric stuff, I wanted to bring up a couple things. At the beginning of season 2, that's the first time we see the giant. Now, you and I have discussed this before, not on the show, but we discussed this scene in the book where Laura and Donna are stoned, and they're having a kind of like a standard boilerplate stoned conversation about, the nature of the universe. But I don't think it's insignificant that they talk about giants. It's October 12th, 1985. Maybe our universe was just a tiny little speck of lint that a huge giant hadn't noticed on a sweater. And someday soon, who knows if this great giant would just brush us off or toss us into a washer and drown us all to death. Donna said maybe our idea of hundreds of years is only a split second to this giant. And soon, something would have to happen, because how long can someone keep a sweater on? Now, obviously, that's like stoned gibberish, but the key here is maybe our idea of hundreds of years is only a split second to this giant. I could kind of see that as something that maybe David Lynch would have, kind of just an image of a giant kind of popping into his head and then using it in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's a much different way, though, because there's a lot of stoner logic going on, but honestly, the giant who wears the sweater where our universe is a speck of lint, that's Lovecraftian almost. That's the fact that we live in a cold and uncaring universe, and there are entities and systems out there that exist outside of us and do not care about us, but they could destroy us at any time should they turn their gaze in our direction.
Right, and the giant in Twin Peaks is the opposite, really. He seems to be the only ally we have.
And at the same time, one could say that the giant is kind of the avatar of a natural universe or process, that he's the spokesman for a Gaia consciousness, perhaps. The not quite intelligent, unconscious ghostwood.
Getting back to the log lady a little bit here, when Laura and the log lady see each other and they have a conversation, I'm going to read a little bit of this. It says, November 10th, 1985. Here are some of the things she told me. She said that sometimes the woods are a place to learn about things and to learn about yourself. Other times the woods are a place for other creatures to be, and it is not for us. She said that sometimes people go camping and learn things they shouldn't. Children are prey sometimes. She said that it is important to remember things you see and feel. Owls are sometimes big. And so those are the lessons that the log lady imparts.
Yeah, there's definitely a interesting relationship that the denizens of Twin Peaks have towards the woods. That's an interaction that's pretty common, especially in European folklore. I guess since it's mostly Europeans that we're dealing with transplanted to America, that's a good place to start. Europeans didn't like the woods much. They feared it as a liminal area that was... C.S. Lewis referred to the woods that the children emerged from the wardrobe in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe as a waste. There was a lantern in it, so they called it Lantern Waste. But really, it was a wood. And the idea that you call a wooded area a waste comes from the fact that you couldn't farm it. And so it was wasted space. And it wasn't cost effective to harvest what it naturally produced. It was either a waste if it was under the auspices of the common people, whereas it was a fine hunting retreat if the nobility owned it. And they didn't let anybody else in there because that was theirs. In one hand, a woodland is economically wasteful, and worse, a woodland is hard to police, so people can go there and be out of sight and from underneath control of the power structures that exist. In Shakespeare, As You Like It, everybody goes into the woods, and yet it's called a pastoral comedy. And yet they're not in a pasture, they're in the woods, because in the woods, you are actually out of the domination and control of the social set as it was. I mean, who are there? There are people on the run. There's a duke that has been dethroned. There are scandalously women traveling alone. There are madmen. All these people who are there are people who are uncontained. They're unbound by society. To the power structures that be, that's some scary shit.
On the flip side, if you go into the woods, you might be at the mercy of those people that are no longer beholden to laws or common decency.
Yeah, that's true too. There's danger and opportunity out there in the woodland. There's also wild animals, so, you might get eaten by wolves and bears.
Yeah.
So, it's not all hippie parties and mushroom caviar.
Yeah, or getting lost and dying of exposure. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
On June 21st, 1986, Laura says, I think that the times that I have gone into the woods at night have poisoned me. The image that flashes in my mind is the oil.
Which is interesting because that's a man-made component kind of polluting the natural environment.
Later, she says on July 25th, 1986, I see now that it is a place of darkness, but I love it. I welcome it. She's talking about the woods. She has a complex relationship with the woods. And the woods, psychologically speaking, I think in Jungian terms, it is a stand-in for the subconscious. The shadow self would reside there, so that's fitting considering this text. Going back to folklore and Aesop and Grimm fairy tales, that's where the witch lives. A place where not only can you go to be lost or to find freedom, but it is also a place where some things beyond your understanding can reside.
Exactly. Of course, one of the things that does take place in the woods, like you say, in Grimm's fairy tales, is the witch's hut. Frederici points out that the woods would be places where villagers would go as an act of defiance and resistance in order to basically have parties and consume food that they've hidden from the tax collectors. They were largely living in a non-monetary system, so when the nobility and the church would come by wanting their due, they would take their crops and their food, because most of them were subsistence farmers. Mm-hmm. So as an act of resistance, they'd hide all this stuff in the woods, and then when nobody was looking, everybody was in on the know who was invited would sneak out there and have a grand old party, usually by a bonfire, get lit, possibly engage in other activities as well. And of course, whenever they found out about that, well, that's witchcraft.
Right. A couple random notes. October 3rd, 1985. Dinner was good tonight. One of my favorite meals, potato pancakes with creamed corn topping and vegetables on the side. It's interesting that she likes creamed corn. This is where creamed corn enters the text. How did David Lynch spin that off into the symbol for pain and suffering?
That's a good question.
One more aside I want to share is August 11th, 1984. It is warm out, and you and I are sitting together leaning at the base of a giant tree, a Douglas fir, Donna's and my favorite. When I look up, it is like the tree is cradling me. It made me think, as you look back to Cooper's first journey into Twin Peaks, the first thing that he notices is the firs, and he's really taken by the Douglas firs. I'm kind of wondering if, because of his later connection with Laura Palmer, actually a preceding connection with Laura Palmer because she's been appearing in his dreams for a while, did he pick up on this with his Douglas fir fixation?
I think he did, because one of the things I was thinking of was that Cooper got on scene awfully fast. I don't know how he could have done that unless he was working out of one of the regional offices. Thus, his being so amazed at the Douglas firs seems really, really strange, because Douglas firs are all over the Pacific Northwest.
In our tribute, we had kind of chalked that up to his kookiness, but rewatching the pilot in preparation for this episode, it's just very specific, and he kind of looks off and he just says Douglas firs, and then later on in the car, he's smelling out the window and he says, smell that fresh air, smell those Douglas firs. It's just kind of interesting that that's something that he really picked up on. Another thing that I'm kind of struck by is August 31st, 1984. Sometimes I think there is someone inside me, but it is another stranger part of me. Sometimes I see her in the mirror. I'm always thinking of the fact that Bob shows up in the series in the reflection, and arguably that reflection is for our benefit, that, we're not supposed to necessarily take it that Leland is literally seeing Bob in the mirror. It is cueing that there is this shift. But I just think it's interesting. The mirror motif comes up in the book, and she says, sometimes I see this other stranger part of me in the mirror.
And eventually, Cooper sees another stranger part of him in the mirror as well.
That's something that David Lynch has talked about. There's been a confusion where people think, and I thought this until, the last couple of years, that Bob is possessing Cooper, when in fact, in a rare moment of definitive statement, David Lynch has said that it is Cooper's doppelganger. Bob is sort of tagging along. So when he sees Bob in the mirror, that is simply a way to indicate to the viewer that Bob's influence is at play. It is not necessarily direct possession. In this book, we're seeing Bob as a sort of a trickster. He's a manipulator. The degree to which he is literally possessing, we don't really know how much that actually happens in any of this. Like, for example, when Leland is possessed and he's dancing with Maddie, you're flipping between the two. Bob is essentially sucking Maddie's face. And then you switch to the shots of Leland and Leland sobbing. That's not a direct possession, really.
Yeah. The deeper I get into it, the more I see Bob as not a possessing entity, but a tempting one.
Right.
What he likes to do is he likes to corrupt someone so that they do things he finds to be fun. What he finds to be really fun is corrupting people so that they become as he thinks. And that's how he possesses people, by almost manipulating their minds so that they're a copy of him.
There is a case of literal possession when Leland is captured. Then he actually takes Leland over completely and speaks through him.
Or at least that's what we see.
That's true.
I mean,
when Bob says that there is this hole where Leland's conscience should be, it's almost like what Bob has done is sort of make a nest. He's like a burrowing insect.
Or he's a mimetic virus that was passed from Leland to Laura because of what she wrote and what she put down, the things that were spread throughout the universal subconscious of Twin Peaks, however you want to look at it. His excuse for the fact that he had no conscience, or that someone passed the virus onto him by abusing and screwing with him and inflicting trauma on him when he was young at Pearl Lakes, that was passed on from him to Laura, from Laura to other people that she interacted with. Viewed in that way, Bob is the story of the cycle of violence in domestic violence. That someone who's abused as a child is much more likely to abuse their children, their partner, as they grow up and go on with life. That's the central tragedy that's just as bad if he would be actually a spirit from a planet made of creamed corn. I don't think it matters so much if he's real or if he's not. The effects are real. The victims are real. And that's good enough. I mean, again, it doesn't matter, because if he's real in the television show Twin Peaks, well, it's a television show. The impossible can be possible there. Frequently, the impossible in fiction is a metaphor or a sigil, a symbol for something else. If he actually is a spirit, or if he just is the psychological damage that's caused by domestic sexual violence, he's certainly a symbol for domestic and sexual violence, and a symbol for the misogyny, the violent and self-destructive aspects of our society. That's what we should take from it as art.
Well said. One of the most intriguing aspects of Laura Palmer as a character, especially in the series, is what post-structuralist theory would call a structuring absence. It's this notion that there is something off-screen, there is something that is not actually represented in the text, but nonetheless governs how everything plays out, the form that the story takes. And that is Laura Palmer. It's also the Laura from the movie Laura, the Otto Preminger film.
Very much.
Laura Palmer, her whole being has rippled through the town because she was so many things for so many people. Structuring absence plays out not only with characters, but trauma. There's a filmmaker named Lucrecia Martel. I think she's Argentinian, and she did these films that deal with a lot of the political upheaval from a lot of the different horrible regimes that have happened in South America that people have lived through that are not mentioned in the story at all. But nonetheless, there's like an almost genetic trauma. She does these stories just sort of about generational trauma that sort of filters down throughout the decades long after something has actually occurred.
The fallout from people being disappeared in the middle of the night.
Yeah. With Twin Peaks,
Laura was disappeared in the middle of the night.
Absolutely. Washed up on a bank. There's a point in the diary where Bob tells her that she needs to be cleansed in the waters.
And be clean. It's almost a biblical reference, a baptism.
Yes. That's one thing that's truly fascinating about her is with all the roles that she played, when you're watching the series and you don't have, the explanations and the stuff that you get later in the book and in the film, Laura is so many things to so many different people that she can't be pinned down. You don't know what she was truly like, and in the film, in the original, that noir film where the detective falls in love with this dead woman, it's not just that he's falling in love with her image. He's sort of falling in love with his idea, who she may have been. It's a motif, of course, that also is in Vertigo, except in that case, you have a man falling in love with a woman that he later tries to recreate with somebody else. That turns out to be the original woman. It's convoluted, but but that's Hitchcock.
Excellent film, though. Yeah. One of the things that got me thinking as I read the diary was that Laura is kind of a figure that embodies the elements. She went through a baptism of water when she was found in the lake. She also had a premonition or a dream of being washed through the lake. She also went through a baptism of fire. She's a figure of earthiness. There's points where she revels in her animal nature, and then there's also points where she is reaching towards the angelic. And sometimes that's as a face, and sometimes that's real. I get the impression that she's not doing the Meals on Wheels program as a front or for any reason other than she wants to do it to help people. And so there's the angel and the devil, the fire and the water. She lives in the air and in the earth, and she's a creature of all seasons, and everyone who sees her sees what they want to see in her, which of course leaves her feeling empty, like everyone sees a different part of me, but who am I really?
That's her kind of primary struggle. She doesn't feel that she has any agency over her own morality. That is what patriarchal systems and misogyny does. That's what being under control means. That you doubt what you think. It's actually kind of a common phrase these days, but it's something that, I hadn't really heard until recent years in common parlance, but it's gaslighting.
Yes.
The idea of forcing someone to not trust their own perceptions. And that is what Bob is doing to Laura. He's obviously a master at that. And speaking of Bob, I was really surprised in The Secret Diary that he offers a clue to what the fire represents in Fire Walk With Me in the poem, or just, he says, this is undated entry, probably August of 1988. Bob says to her, "Someone of wisdom is always more difficult to communicate with. This is the fire that you must walk through." Someone of wisdom. And of course, he's referring to himself, you think, but, wisdom is an odd choice of words. You could think that basically insight into things that you don't understand, but she is merely being affected by this force, this primal force that is not beholden to, the laws of nature or physics, apparently.
Yes, and that makes sense because the patriarchy isn't natural. The methods of control and the strictures of society that we find ourselves in now are not a natural condition for human beings. They are a direct result of agriculture, or at least that's how I see it or choose to see it or interpret it.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot goes into it, but what you said about it coming along at the same time as capitalism makes sense. Obviously, this is an ancient dynamic, but the fact that it was harnessed most effectively when capitalism came around makes sense.
There are two books that I would recommend to people who are interested in the problems and processes that I believe Lynch is trying to grapple with. I would recommend Caliban and the Witch, and I would also recommend Sex at Dawn by Casilda Jetha and Christopher Ryan. We've talked about Caliban and the Witch before. Sex at Dawn is about the prehistoric origins of modern sexuality. And it deals with both monogamy and how monogamy in our current social culture, our current idea of what marriage and family looks like, and how a re-examining of anthropological data and a broader look at some still existing cultures indicates that what we think is the baseline and always has been might not be anything like what we thought.
What I'm reminded of is the sort of startling revelation that Leo and Jacques and Ronette were sort of Laura's safe place to go.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah. Their presence is, it's like sometimes like, oh boy, it's a good thing that she managed to go back to Jacques' cabin and avoid this, and it's just like, wow, that is an interesting kind of shift. But it's this kind of thing where there was a sexuality there that she was entirely too young to be engaged in, and they're statutory rapists. I don't want to gloss over that fact.
Oh yeah. But she felt safe there because frankly, she had them wrapped around her little finger.
Right.
She was able to manipulate them, and she knew who they really were. as opposed to Bob, where he was just an impossible presence that could do whatever he liked, whenever he liked, and had access to her deepest, most innermost thoughts.
Let's talk a little bit about the next reading that we're going to be releasing. Guy de Maupassant's The Horla.
Yeah, if ever there was a tale that reminded me of Bob, it's The Horla. Would you like to give a brief rundown on The Horla for people who haven't read it or heard the reading yet?
The Horla is a story by Guy de Maupassant written in the mid-1800s, I think, or the late, 1880s, I think. It's also in the form of a diary. And writing in the form of a diary, writing fiction in the form of a diary is interesting because there's already a little bit of kind of believability baked in. It's a subjective point of view, but it's also kind of in a form that makes you feel like it's a real, authentic object. This is the form that this book takes, and it's the point of view of a man who may or may not be
utterly insane
or menaced by an invisible alien creature that subsists on water and milk, is trying to essentially get inside his head, control his life, and destroy him. And it's a great story. It is kind of interesting because before we knew that we were going to be doing this particular episode on Laura Palmer, we had this story kind of queued up to be the next reading anyway. We thought that it would be an interesting story to do. It was a big influence on H.P. Lovecraft and all, but after reading The Secret Diary of Laura Palmer, it's clearly appropriate. So I'll be looking for that story soon, probably within a week or so after we release this episode. And happy Twin Peaks Day, everybody. And if you could do us a favor and go over to iTunes and you give us a 5-star rating, maybe leave us a review, we appreciate it. It increases our visibility, apparently. It's always a good thing. And you can find us on Twitter at C_Esperanto. We're pretty active on there.
If you seek to not have your communications read by either the NSA or GCHQ or the other 5 years, go ahead and enclose your correspondence within a physical medium and send it through the mail service to P.O. Box 13313, Spokane Valley, Washington 99213-3313. We're the address with all those threes in it.
Wow, is the Postal Service still going?
It is, and some of us enthusiasts are seeking to keep it alive, even in the face of a bunch of stupidity.
Seriously, folks, he even has a collection of wax seals and old school typewriters that you just wouldn't believe. That's pretty awesome.
Any mail correspondence gets one free reply via my very favorite Royal HH. That's a typewriter.
Thanks for clarifying. All right, thank you, everybody, and take care. And we hope to be releasing things at least with slightly more regularity than we have been.
Because we're once again regular and not associated with any horrifying diseases of the bowel.
On that note, good night.
Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Counter Esperanto podcast on the Pseudospaces Network. Please direct all email correspondence to counteresperanto@pseudospaces. That's PSEUDOSPAC.es. Thank you.